3 years in the making, produced at a cost of more than $1 million, and boasting a cast of thousands, Universal Studios' The Man Who Laughs was one of the most ambitious and unconventional films of its era, a monument to the expressive power of the silent screen. The genesis of the film began 5 years earlier with the release of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Universal Studios head Carl Laemmle invested a small fortune in the production, constructing enormous sets on the studio backlot and populating them with costumed extras. But the greater gamble was building such an extravagant epic around the hideously misshapen form of Quasimodo. Beginning as a versatile character actor, Lon Chaney had risen through the ranks of bit players and supporting casts to carve out a place for himself in leading roles. He became a star not in spite of, but because of his unconventional looks, his willingness to contort his face and body to render himself the human animal. Not merely an unsightly villain, Chaney's devious characters were three-dimensional, often nursing broken hearts beneath their hardened exteriors. This formula was the key to Chaney's popularity, and it was also a central component to many of Universal's early horror films. When Hunchback proved to be a phenomenal success, Universal began preparing another Chaney vehicle along similar lines. Again, a French novel provided the foundation for the film, Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera. Equally extravagant, with a familiar blend of romantic tragedy and diabolical thrills, The Phantom of the Opera was one of the highest-grossing films of the decade. It was only logical that Laemmle should repeat the successful formula once again, so he returned to the author of Hunchback, Victor Hugo. The novel L'Homme qui rit appeared in America as The Laughing Man, as well as under its more familiar title, The Man Who Laughs. Opening in the year 1690 and continuing into the 1700s, the novel follows the plight of Gwynplaine. Heir to a British lordship, he is kidnapped by his father's political enemies and surgically disfigured by a brotherhood of gypsies known as Comprachicos. Deserted by the ghouls who disfigured him, Gwynplaine forms a kind of family with Dea, a child he finds abandoned in the snow, and Ursus, a kind-hearted carnival showman. Dea grows up to be a beautiful woman, but is permanently blind. Her sightless eyes shield her from the horror of Gwynplaine's appearance, but enable her to perceive the gentle spirit that dwells behind the hideous smile. Production of The Man Who Laughs did not evolve exactly as intended. In 1927, Chaney was under contract to MGM, where he was being showcased in a rapid succession of films tailored to his persona. That year alone, he starred in 4 films, including the legendary London After Midnight. Leaving MGM for Universal, even for a single film, was out of the question. Rather than assigning the film to one of the studio's contract stars, Laemmle sought a more unconventional solution. Laemmle turned to the cinema of his homeland, where ambitious filmmakers were resisting the American trend towards clean aesthetics and glamorous storylines. German expressionist filmmakers were drawn to more troubling themes and darker aesthetics. Shadow, not light, was the dominant visual element. The sets were often distorted, almost to the point of abstraction. Performance grew stylized. All these elements served to create a universe very different from the Never Never Land of Hollywood. The expressionist terrain was more psychological than literal, a place of nightmare, despair, madness. Foremost among expressionist works was Robert Wien's 1919 film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. In which a skeletal sleepwalker prowls the countryside and commits murder at the bidding of his master, a carnival hypnotist. In the role of Caesar was an actor who would become an icon of expressionism, Conrad Veidt. His lanky figure, his angular facial features perfectly suited the nightmare aesthetic of expressionism. This was the Gwynplaine Laemmle was looking for. In 1920, he portrayed a Jekyll and Hyde type character in F.W. Murnau's Januskow. Here, he plays a blind painter in Murnau's tragic romance, Journey into the Night. In the 1924 film Waxworks, Veidt portrayed Ivan the Terrible and gleefully depicted the tyrant's mental deterioration. The director was Paul Leni. Leni had begun his career as a designer in the Deutsches Theater under Max Reinhardt, the theatrical producer who tutored many of Expressionism's greatest artists, including F.W. Murnau, Edgar G. Ulmer, and even Conrad Veidt. Leni had already directed 3 films with Veidt, including The Mystery of Bagalore and Prince Cuckoo. But it was Waxworks that earned Leni a contract at Universal Studios. Leni was signed by Universal in 1926 and soon directed the classic chiller The Cat and the Canary, a Germanic, old dark house film which introduced Leni to cinematographer Gilbert Warrenton, who would prove to be an invaluable collaborator on The Man Who Laughs. Once Conrad Veidt and Paul Leni became associated with the project, The Man Who Laughs was no longer an imitation Lon Chaney film. It became something wholly unique. Drawing from his own design experience, Leni envisioned a shadowy, haunted world worthy of his expressionist background, superbly accomplished by art director Charles D. Hall, who would later design the sets for Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Old Dark House. In many ways, The Man Who Laughs laid the groundwork for the Universal horror films that would soon follow. Films that established the horror movie genre and set the aesthetic standard for decades to come. The same man who designed Frankenstein's monster, Jack Pierce, also devised the makeup effects that would spread a grin across Gwynplaine's mutilated face. Veidt was fitted with a set of oversized dentures. Small hooks, mounted on the sides, allowed the corners of Veidt's mouth to be drawn back into that ghastly, permanent grin. The device rendered Veidt unable to speak, so the actor's range of expression was limited to body movement and the dramatic power of his eyes. There is only one scene in which Veidt is not wearing the oversized dentures, and that is the scene with Duchess Josiana, who attempts to seduce the young man. A veteran of the Moscow Art Theater Company, which she abandoned during a U.S. tour, Olga Baklanova quickly adapted to the silent screen. Of her love-making scene with Veit, one film critic wrote, "Baklanova burns holes in the screen." Her most famous role, one very similar to this one, would come 4 years later as the femme fatale in Todd Browning's Freaks. In a more sympathetic romantic role, Mary Philbin was cast as Dea. Philbin had been discovered by director Erich von Stroheim in a well-publicized talent search. She was given a bit part in Foolish Wives, but von Stroheim kept her face hidden until he could debut her in a more suitable starring role, his 1923 epic, Merry-Go-Round. Von Stroheim was fired from the production during the making of the film, but Philbin, under contract to the studio, remained at Universal. During production of The Man Who Laughs, von Stroheim paid a visit to the set to offer his blessings to Philbin. Philbin went on to win the starring role of Universal's mega-production, The Phantom of the Opera, and it was certainly this performance that landed her the role of Dea. One of Philbin's co-stars in Phantom was Cesare Gravina, who had previously appeared in the Lon Chaney vehicle The Penalty, and was also a member of von Stroheim's stock company. Gravina's wild eyes and fierce acting style made him perfectly suited to a supporting role in The Man Who Laughs. Because the film was produced and released during that crucial transitional point in American film history, when silent cinemas were being rewired for sound, Universal carefully considered whether or not to integrate sound in The Man Who Laughs. The question of dialogue was easily resolved by the fact that Veit could hardly speak while wearing his dental apparatus. Instead, Universal shot the film as a silent and offered it to sound theaters with an orchestral, movie-toned soundtrack. As was common during this period, studios used films to popularize songs and then market the sheet music, the modern-day equivalent being the marketing of soundtrack recordings. This explains the prominent placement of When Love Comes Stealing. The sound revolution was rapidly changing the face of American cinema. Conrad Veidt, self-conscious of his German accent, returned to Germany in 1929, even though he was rumored to be the star of Universal's screen version of Dracula. When Veidt reached his fatherland, the occasion was celebrated by a gala screening of The Man Who Laughs, which Veidt personally attended. The Man Who Laughs marked the end of Lenny and Veidt's collaboration. Lenny made only one more film, The Last Warning, before he died suddenly of blood poisoning in 1929.